Good morning and welcome to another edition of the Covenant Sunday School class. Last Sunday was the first of what was to be a series of lessons based on Charles Stanley's book. But much like a TV series that gets canceled after the first episode, I've taken the authority vested in me by virtue of being an unpaid volunteer Sunday school teacher to switch series. I think the first hint of that was when I fell asleep 2 or 3 times while I was preparing today's lesson based on the old series. So I decided if I couldn't stay awake, I couldn't keep the rest of you awake, so I've switched over. And I'm going to be using a book as a guideline for this series. Another favorite Christian author of mine, Philip Yancey. And this book is entitled, The Jesus I Never Knew. Now, in this book, Philip Yancey kind of traces the way in which his view of Jesus changed from the time he was a young lad until he grew into a Christian minister. From that simplistic view that he started with, which was kind of based on a portrait that I think all of us remember growing up. They had the picture of Jesus with the long hair and with the beard and kind of his arms stretched out like the Good Shepherd. And that was Philip Yancey's view of Jesus. In his book, Yancey points out the irony of that particular portrait, which the seminary that Yancey was attending prohibited long hair and beards. He thought it was somewhat ironical that this famous picture of Jesus had those and his seminary prohibited it. It may be a Sunday school lesson in there somewhere. But as he went further into his Christian walk, grew in Christian maturity, he began to realize that there was a completely different, better, more in-depth view of Jesus. And the more he began to see this, the stronger his Christianity became. I was reminded of back a number of years ago, many years ago now, when they were televising the Olympics. They started that process of singling out individuals. Up close and personal was what they call that. And so you would get to know a lot more about the particular athlete before the Olympic Games actually started. And it's amazing what a difference that made, at least for me, in terms of my interest. Once I knew that person or felt like I did, I was more interested in what they did. And so that's my goal for this series. I hope that as we take a closer look at this person of Jesus and get to know him better, then we take a greater interest in what he had to say. Now, Philip Yancey began his journey of growth by going back to the birth of Jesus in his early days. And in that, he emphasized the Jewish basis for Jesus' life. The roots of Jesus were founded in Judaism. And it's sometimes difficult for Christians to fully embrace the fact that Jesus was a Jew. He was raised in the Jewish tradition, and until his death, he remained a Jew. The question for us is, how did those Jewish traditions define who Jesus was? From birth all the way up until his death, how did the Jewish culture shape him as a person and his message? Now, I suggest to you these are questions that we need to ask and answer if we really are going to get to know Jesus up close and personal. Just to show you how this fact that Jesus was a Jew is emphasized in the Bible, Matthew starts his account out in the first chapter, first verses of Matthew. We find an extensive genealogy, and it's actually truthfully kind of boring to read, but when you read that first number of verses in first chapter of Matthew, it traces Jesus' genealogy through 42 generations, going back to David, the king, and then ultimately back to Abraham. But it traces that entire lineage of Judaism for the birth of for Jesus. Now, Jesus grew up during a time when there was a resurgent interest in Jewish pride. It was a time in history where the Jewish people took another look at themselves and said, we are proud of who we are. It was important effort to resist the Greek culture that was trying to be imposed upon them. It was an attempt to resist the domination of the Roman authorities. So the Jewish people began to, in their effort to keep these cultures from absorbing them, started trying to retain their own identity. And one of the ways they did that was they started naming their children after some of the we'll call it Old Testament patriarchs, their forefathers, much like black community has done for the last few years, where many Afro-American children have names that to us seem weird and unusual, and yet to them it's their effort to retain their black culture. And this is what the Jewish people at that time had begun to do with their children. For example, Mary was named after Miriam. Joseph was named after one of the 12 sons of Jacob. And the name Jesus came from the name Joshua, which meant, or translated, he shall save. The name Jesus was a popular name back then, much like Joe or Bob today. But the whole naming the people was just one symptom of the Jewish people's attempt to retain their own culture. Now we know from the studies we've done that these early traditions, Jewish traditions, were very much a part of Jesus' life. From his circumcision at birth, up until the time that he began to travel with his parents to go to Jewish festivals, many times, many miles away. As an adult, we know from the New Testament that Jesus preached in synagogues and temples. He spoke in terms that his Jewish brethren would understand. I would suggest to you that if Jesus had been alive during the 1940s, he might well have been one of the Jewish people that were sent away to concentration camps. Jesus was a Jew. Now, as a part of examining that Jewish background, let's take a closer look at the province that he grew up in and that he did his ministry in, Galilee. Now, I've learned some interesting things about Galilee. By all accounts, contrary to what we sometimes think when we think of that area, this was a beautiful area of the Middle East. Jesus' hometown of Nazareth sat up 1,300 feet above sea level, and the view from there provided not only the panorama from Mount Carmel, but beautiful snow-capped mountains to the north. And that's just a scene we don't often think of when we think about Jesus and where he grew up. Philip Yancey described that area in this way. He says, with fertile land, beautiful vistas, and moderate climate, Galilee had its attractions, and clearly Jesus enjoyed his childhood there. Just the idea of maybe think of South Walden and Destin and Fort Walden as being a beautiful place people like to live, like to be. That was really the way it was in that area. Now we are told that Herod the Great, the Roman king, had a prosperous place to live in Galilee. He had a winter resort on the shore of Galilee, and there was nearby Nazareth, a town that was just resplendent with attractions. Again, let me just read some of the features of that. Colonnaded streets, a forum, luxurious villas, all constructed in white limestone and colored marble. But the truth is, only the wealthy landlords and visitors got to enjoy those luxurious surroundings. Most of the residents of that area were either poor fishermen or landless peasants. And Jesus' family, we know, Jesus grew up in a poverty situation. He was raised in poverty. So think of that as the influence that had on him as he was growing up. Could see, for there's no record in the Bible that he ever actually visited King Herod's beautiful place or this town that I spoke of that was fairly close to Nazareth. So he saw this, and yet his area immediately around him was surrounded by people in poverty. Now there's some other facts about the province of Galilee that I found interesting, and most importantly, help us get to know the real Jesus. Galilee was the most backward culture in that region. Its inhabitants were considered country bumpkins. They were fodder for ethnic jokes. They spoke with a distinct sound of their language. It was different from the other area and kind of suggested that they weren't the most brilliant of people. Maybe a little bit ridiculed, as if those of us that had southern drawls experienced sometimes as we were growing up. So the fact is that Galilee was an area that was known as if you would, a backward area in terms of culture. A second characteristic of Galilee was that it was known for its laxness in spirituality. Now think of that contrast and the impact that had on Jesus. Galilee as a whole was known as a region that was lax in spiritual matters. Jesus' own brothers encouraged him to leave Galilee and to go to Judea. Even Nicodemus, who was a supporter of Jesus, had this to say to Jesus, "Are you from Galilee too? Look into it, and you will find that a prophet does not come out of Galilee." I suggest to you, when you look at Galilee from that perspective, is it any wonder that the Jews did not believe that Jesus was the Messiah? The third thing you need to know about Galilee is that it had a reputation as being a breeding ground for revolutionaries. You have to understand that at that time, in that area, Jews were looked at as atheists because they did not believe in the Roman gods, didn't believe in the Greek gods. We're told that during that time there were 8 million Jews around the world. A quarter of those Jews lived in this small area of the Middle East. And that group of people constantly rebuked the efforts of Greece and Rome. Greek to impose their culture and Rome to dominate them. They were a force of change and of resistance. Now their resistance came in a number of different forms from a number of different groups. And we know from studies we've done in the past, from reading the New Testament, we know many of those groups. They were the Essenes. That was a group that approached this resistance effort, this attempt to protect themselves from the Greeks and from the Romans. The Essenes did it more in a peace-like manner. They believed in the nonviolent approach. As a matter of fact, many of them moved into monk-like abodes in the barren desert. Another faction were the Zealots. They were the obstructionists. They actively searched for ways to keep this controversy alive, to keep these burning issues in the forefront. I don't mean to be unfair, but perhaps for our purposes, they were almost like the looters today. They wanted controversy because it was their belief that's the only way we're really going to deal with these important issues. A third group were the Sadducees. The Sadducees tried to blend in with the Greeks or the Romans, and they were generally known as the collaborators. They were much like the situation in World War II, where the Vichy government in France kind of took over in the late 1930s, in the early part of 1940, when the Germans were coming in to occupy France. The Vichy government, who were French, they were the collaborators. They stayed there until the England and the United States kind of came in and took over. Another group were the Pharisees. Now, the Pharisees were kind of in the middle of all of this turmoil. They picked their battles carefully. Sometimes they sided with the Jews and sometimes with the Gentiles, just basically trying to resist, but also trying to avoid confrontation. You take all of these groups, different in the way in which they tried to protect the Jewish culture and the Jewish traditions, but they had one thing in common. All of these wide spectrum of political factions and groups that were determined to do something, the one thing they had in common were they were building a fence around their culture to protect it from the Romans and from the Greeks. They were determined to maintain that Jewish tradition. And then along came Jesus, preaching that the color of our skin, our nationality, our political party, the particular group where we chose to express our differences, that really shouldn't make any difference to those who truly worship God. And so Jesus became a threat to all of those groups, not just to the Romans and the Greeks, but to all of those others within the Jewish group that were trying to fight off and preserve this Jewish culture. The Zealots, the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the Romans, all of them not only distrusted Jesus, but that they were so fearful of him that's why they crucified him. Now, we think we live in a divisive time, and we do. But I would suggest to you that a close reading of history would suggest that 2020 pales in comparison to the divisiveness that existed 2,000 years ago. And so if we are to know Jesus, we need to know about the tumultuous time that he lived in and how he coped with it and how he resisted the pressures of all of those that were, quote, out to get him. And as a part of that historical background, you have to remember, Rome was on the verge of accomplishing worldwide peace. A goal we've strived for ever since. Worldwide peace. They were close to accomplishing that. The main reason that they didn't was this pocket of resistance in the Middle East. But the problem was, in their attempt to achieve world peace, they were doing it through the sword. And because of that, the Jewish people, these people resisted, they bore the brunt of the sword in their efforts to maintain their culture. It was a terrible existence for them because of the physical domination by the Romans, the mental domination by the Greeks. There was an unpleasant, and here they were constantly trying to resist these efforts, this small pocket in the world. And because of that, for hundreds of years, they prayed for a Messiah, somebody to come take us out of this plight that we are in. They prayed for a great ruler, a Messiah, who would come down and literally wipe out the Roman authorities. And not only were they faced with that kind of domination during this period of time, Palestine was besieged with natural disasters. We know of an earthquake during that time that killed over 30,000 people. famines were occurring regularly. Locusts were swarming the region. The plea of the Jews was, God, send the Messiah. We have to have some help. As I was reading that in the intensity of that plea, I was reminded of a story. My father, like many of those that participated in World War II, didn't speak of that a whole time in his life. And yet I distinctly remember one time being with him when he was with another veteran, a friend of his from Crestview, who had served in the Pacific during the Second World War. And that individual, too, was not prone to talking about it, but it was only in the conversation between the two of them and me sitting there as a silent eavesdropper that they began to recollect memories. And the one individual that had been in the Pacific told about the time when he and his group were taken off of a ship to try to take over an island in the Pacific that was occupied by the Japanese. And he said when they got onto the island, they discovered that the information they had previously, the intelligence was faulty. There were far more Japanese there than they ever anticipated, far more heavily armed. And he said, we were just basically sent to our deaths. He said, they were just right on top of us, firing at us. And he said, finally, one of our members, called, radioed back to the ship that we had come off of and said, start firing into us. And the ship replied back, there's no separation. And he said, we don't care. We're going to get killed if we don't do something. Fire these weapons into us. And without being overly dramatic, that's kind of the way the Jewish people were at that time. Just, God, send us some relief. And then 2,000 years ago, God answered their prayers. He sent them the Messiah. But the Greeks refused to accept him. The Romans didn't accept him. And ironically, the Jewish people did not accept him. How could you accept as the Messiah somebody who would come riding into town on a donkey and simply proclaim love and peace? This was contrary to all that they expected, all that they needed. And so in an ironic turn of historical fate, a Jewish person became the focal point of a group of people who were not Jewish, the Gentiles. It is my hope and prayer that in the weeks ahead, as we peel back the layers of this onion and see more clearly the face and life of Jesus, as we come to see him up close and personal, that it will lead each of us to a closer, better understanding of who he is, and in that way help us embrace even more his teachings. If we could close with prayer. Dear Heavenly Father, give us the ability with our hearts and our minds to see more clearly Jesus, to see him, to embrace him, and once we do, to be able to spread the good news. These things we ask in your name and for your sake. Amen.